Hey everyone, Will Brink here, brinkzone.com. Going to change topics today and get back to audio. If you've been watching this channel, you know besides my usual topics of health and fitness and all that, I actually am a audiophile and have done some reviews, and I do review a number of things that are not fitness health related, and audio is being one of them. And today's actually going to be a slightly different show because I'm actually going to interview somebody. So speakers, active speakers have been a very controversial topic with audiophiles for a long, long time. They've been around for forever. I mean, it's interesting that you'll generally find in recording studios and mixing studios and such, you will usually find active speakers like ATC and a few other well-known brands. And in people's homes, most audiophiles, you're going to find passive speakers, being run by separate amplifiers, and the two groups have not really met until more recently. So there has definitely been an uptick in interest and development in active speakers. And what's just for people that may not be aware, active speaker is, of course, as it sounds, the speaker itself has its own amplification in the speaker. Obviously, your basic your basic desktop speakers and stuff, people are aware of. But even at the higher end, there have been for actually a number of decades even, active speakers. Like I say, you'll find them in mixing recording studios very commonly. But because of the technology changing with things like high-end Class D amplifiers, and just better technology, computers, and so forth, there has definitely been an increase in active speakers. I don't want to say making a comeback because they never went away, but you will find that over the decades, and I've been in audio and interested in audio for 30 years, you will find that almost most major companies have produced or tried to produce and sell active speakers at one time or another. And usually those active speakers got great reviews from reviewers, but buyers just didn't warm up to them, and so they usually went away. And you'll find a number of major brands have gotten into actives and tried to market them, got very good reviews, and then they kind of disappeared. But I would say in the last, I don't know, 3-4 years, something in that ballpark, I think we're seeing a real uptick in the interest in actives. I think you find most brands, major brands, are now starting to offer actives. And a brand that came up on my radar. So I actually, I'm a regular viewer and reader of Audioholics. If you don't subscribe to Audioholics, you should. It's definitely one of the best websites and YouTube channels. Gene's channel for all things audio, home theater. With being a scientist myself and a science guy, what you get is objective measurements with his stuff, which you don't get with a lot of other audio reviews. I really appreciate that. It's one thing Gene does really well, is calling out a lot of the misinformation that exists in audio, which I'm being polite because it's really something else. But there's a lot of nonsense in audio. Again, as I think that with people like Gene and others, Amir at Audio Science, I think it's Audio Science Reviews, getting into measurements, objective measurements, in addition, of course, to subjective listening and all that, we're starting to see much better information. So on Audioholics, again, I've had an interest in actives, for a long time. They've always been on my radar. I've always wanted to try a pair of high-end actives in my system, and I never found the right one or the right fit or whatever. So Audioholics just gave a speaker, an active speaker from a small company in Norway called Sigberg Audio, a product of the year award. So that kind of got me interested, and I looked into it, and of course I read and listened to the review of the speaker, and I really was impressed with the technology that's gone into this speaker. Again, there's a lot going on with this speaker besides just being active. So I contacted the owner and asked him to maybe have a discussion with me about actives in general. I think this is a topic that people in the audio world are interested in and always have a controversial take on. And then maybe we'll talk a bit about his speaker. And I am planning to review these speakers in the not too distant future. So this is sort of, let's call this an intro. Let's see. So let me bring Thorborn Sigberg. Hopefully I pronounced Thorborn correctly. Probably not. But anyway, so there he is. Hi, Thorborn.
Nice to meet you. Hi.
How are you?
I'm
All right.
fine. And you?
Good. So obviously you heard my intro a bit about, and I thought what we could talk about is sort of just a big general discussion of actives. I think that I've noticed a lot of companies, major companies are starting to, I would say, reintroduce, if not introduce actives. They must be feeling maybe like the time is right for maybe the acceptance of actives to be higher. I'm thinking maybe even just because there's a younger generation of people into audio that are more accepting of electronics that are one piece,
Yeah, and I guess it's probably driven by sort of streaming and people wanted to get maybe all-in-one solutions and just
Yeah.
a easier setup, basically.
Yeah, and there is that too, of course. Yeah, wasn't even thinking about that, but yeah, the ease of setup, of course, is that much higher for people that want sort of all-in-one streamlined setups. So, the pros of active speakers are kind of obvious, but I don't think that a lot of people appreciate what the pros are of an active speaker. What do you view as the pro of going active?
Yes. So I mentioned a lot of the solutions are more like all-in-one. Obviously, you get the amplifier, but some has streaming capabilities as well. But that's not necessarily what you think is important as an audiophile. You're more interested in the quality, right?
Yeah.
So the making it easier for the consumer wasn't necessarily why I have made active speakers. It's more about the capabilities you can have. You can have individual amps for each speaker driver. You get digital crossovers. So as a developer of a speaker, you can actually make a much better speaker in less time, and you can spend basically more time developing instead of doing like have an analog crossover. You have to take it in and out of the speaker. You have to take components in and out while you experiment. While on digital crossover, you can do it much faster and you can actually do it more precise as well.
Right.
So you get more advanced crossovers and you can do more things that basically isn't possible in an analog speaker.
Right. Well, along with really high quality Class D amplification like Hypex.
Yeah.
Also, the other thing that's become much more common is DSP.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that's really becoming a factor in audio. Again, I think a lot of old school audiophiles, and me included, like I never liked, 20 years ago and stuff. I didn't like equalizers at all. To me they added because they didn't add, they degraded the signal sound to me, and most quote unquote pure audiophiles years ago, 30 years ago, wouldn't touch such a thing. And I think once you have a certain impression of things, it's hard to change it. Same thing with Class D amplifiers. I really never liked Class D amplifiers up until, for me at least, I don't think I heard a good Class D amplifier up until about 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
That was just recent that I have to admit that I was a very holdout to the Class D, the idea of Class D amplifiers. They've gotten very good.
Yeah, so there's several interesting points. So let me get back to the DSP part, but it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of the purity. You had a period maybe in the 90s, especially, where everyone wanted to press the pure direct button on the ramp because they wouldn't like to have any tone controls because it degraded the sound, right?
Right.
But it went sort of too far. So in a period there, you I think a lot of people had quite bright sounding systems because they wanted to have everything neutral. They were afraid to touch the loudness button. That
Yeah.
actually were a good thing to get the fuller sound when you listen to moderate levels and things like that. And fast forward to actives today, you see a lot of interesting smaller active speakers that do things with DSP that isn't possible in a passive speaker. So you could get a really small speaker with a lot of bass, for instance, because you use EQ basically to lift the bass.
Right.
And both the DSP is basically lossless these days, and as you mentioned as well, the Class D amps. A lot of people remember it basically from the early 2000s sub amplifiers.
Yeah.
They didn't sound that good, and they broke all the time, right?
Yeah.
But
They
that's
sounded terrible. I mean, yeah, they were.
but that's nothing like the Class D of today.
Yeah. No, and like I say, I'm included in the group that would not go near a Class D amplifier
Yeah.
up until pretty recently. I would say, like maybe I would say the last 3-4 years or so that they've really gotten good enough to challenge a good quality, Class AB amplifier.
But I think they've actually been pretty good for probably 10, 15 years. We started with maybe Ice Power from Denmark, which is actually quite good. But if, as you said, it takes a lot of time before people sort of accept and realize that, okay, this old sort of sayings isn't basically right anymore.
Yeah. No, and like I say, and I'm guilty of that too. Like I said, I'm a slow adopter of technology, new technology. So for me, like I say, for me to finally admit, like 3-4 years ago, that Class D amplifiers could be very good means they were probably good, as you said, for 10 years. But like I say, I went from a film camera to a digital camera very late. I really was sure that you could just not get a great picture from a digital camera. Now it's the only thing I would use. But yeah, I know that Class D has probably been good a lot longer than I think it has been.
Yeah, and it's sort of hard to. It's not necessarily a bad. This is a hobby after all. You could say, okay, don't you want the best possible sound? Yes, of course, most people do, but it's also about like some part of nostalgia. People still buy tube amps, right? Because it's the entire experience. It's just not just the sound quality. It's the entire experience of having cool stuff as well.
For me, at least, I mean, of course, this is very controversial, but when you're talking about tube amps and records, I think a lot of the experience for people that still love their records and their phonographs is the nostalgia and the experience.
Yeah.
Of it, and I know they'll fight back and forth about what sounds better. But I still think that when you have nostalgia for something, it sounds better to you. It's going to sound, have a certain warm sound to it. That brings back feelings, memories of a certain. I'm definitely a digital person. I'm all digital. I like the highest dynamic range I can get. I want the lowest noise floor I can get, and all that. That's me. But that's. But yeah, as you said, a lot of that, even the sound can be nostalgic.
And that's the sort of the opposition. Perhaps people who like tube amps, they typically go around and say all Class D amps sound very clinical, very cold, they sound hard, and you get a lot of myths like that it's not necessarily true at all.
Yeah, well, like I said, we've had. I mean, we've obviously had lossless chips for a long time, 30 years. A long time, at least 30 years. We probably had lossless chips. And the problem, I know, wasn't the chip. Really, the problem was what was done on the input and the output, going in and out of the chip, was where the issue of the sound quality was really coming from. But I know that a lot of people will say the chips have gotten better. Now they're lossless chips, and I know we've had lossless high quality chips for, like I say, at least 30 years. And I think the difference in sound that we are starting to get from, DACs and whatever sound is more along the lines of how it's going. What's the input and how's the output from the chip that they're utilizing. And I think, there's always a chip war, companies have to come up with new chips to sell stuff, and I don't blame them. I guess that's just the way the business works. But I think there's the chips you could use from 20 years ago that, if you put them in the same setup, are going to sound basically the same. I know there's discussions on Burr Brown versus. Back again 20, 30 years ago, Burr Brown was like the ultimate chip, and now I suppose there's better. So, I mean, obviously the other pro, talking to other designers that I've talked to and, at audio shows and such, is that obviously being able to match the amplifier to the driver, you can't do any
Yeah.
better than that. I mean, you can
No.
perfectly match the characteristics of that amplifier to that driver.
Mm.
And it would make sense that takes out a lot of trial and error work, with your amplifiers to find out
Yeah.
what works best.
Yeah,
And
because one thing is power, and the other thing is that based on the load and how the speaker reacts and what type of amplifier it is, the frequency response can actually change. Also, there's some discussions about can you hear difference between amplifiers, but they actually react to the load of the speaker, so they can sound different and can change the frequency response. But
right.
if you design in the app, you take that out of the equation.
And I mean, a lot of times, so a lot of times you end up either you might buy some new speakers that don't match well with your amplifier, and then you end up having to buy, like, as soon as you change one thing in the chain, you end up having to change all these things in the chain. That's happened to me. And you can do a certain amount of research to try to match the characteristics of the amplifier to the speaker, but you just don't know. In one of the stores that I used to work with, because I don't know about the U.S., but in Norway, but in the U.S., we used to have a lot more audio stores, like really good little stores that had high-end stuff, and we would go in and talk to people. Those stores are just not very common anymore, unfortunately. And one of the stores that I used to go to, they knew me, and they would let me take speakers home and put them in my own house and listen to them. And that was the only way I was going to buy them, because these were, expensive speakers, but they were great like that. And that's not a common thing anymore, where you can't go into a big box store here in the U.S. and say, I'd like to take these home for, 24 hours or 48 hours. But the places that I used to work in, and this was in Boston, if they knew you had a relationship with them because they knew you were an honest person, they would let you take a pair of speakers home and bring them back a couple days later. And that was the only way you could really decide. And that, of course, is now getting into the room. Of course, your listening space, which is, I don't know, half the battle at least. And I think if there's anything I've learned, the older I get, how important the room is. The setup in the room is to listening. And I think when we're younger, we just think more power and bigger speakers will fix it. And I think
that's quite interesting when developing speakers, because then obviously we test the speaker in a lot of different rooms, right? And it sounds like completely different speakers in different rooms. It's amazing how different it is. So most people certainly underestimate the room, and for some people, the testing different components is part of the hobby. That's fine, right? But if you're trying to get the best sound, it's not necessarily the best way to go about it.
How's that? What is the best?
If you just try to like randomly mix and match speakers or amplifiers, and maybe all along it was, as you mentioned, maybe it's the room that's the problem, right? You try to switch out speakers, but
I think a lot of times people's problems with what they're not getting what they want is the room, and they'll keep buying new stuff, because of course if you go into the store, they're going to tell you need something new. Of course, that's how business works. But on some of the Facebook groups that I'm on, audiophile groups, and someone will show a picture of their system and say, I'm looking at changing out amplifiers and something, and me and many other people will say, why don't you just try pulling those speakers away from the wall? You see them push right up against the wall, out of the way, or but you can see that what they have is an excellent system, potentially an excellent system, and many times. The first thing that comes to my mind is, your room has a lot of diffraction. You need to obviously you need to either move those speakers around, you need to add, and I just think that's something you learn as time goes on. I mean, you're obviously, as a designer and all that, maybe more ahead of the curve than I am, but I think that's something that when I was younger and newer to audio, I never really thought about the room. If something didn't sound right or whatever, I thought, I need bigger speakers. I need a different amp. I need that. So, and what what I'm sort of getting with that also is that along with newer technology, and technology that's accessible, is room correction. DSP. I think to me, I think that's a game-changing technology that everybody should be using at this point. I don't see any reason to not be utilizing room correction. There's several companies that make excellent room correction DSPs. I'm thinking that your speakers, being they've got a parametric equalizer, right? 10 band
and 9 band. Yeah.
9 band. So 9 band equalizer. Obviously, there's a lot of potential there for room. To playing with that to doing room correction. And you could probably do it. Obviously, you could either use something like mini DSP and work with the equalizer to get the sound you want, or flatten out the curves or whatever. But
that's another sort of interesting divide, I guess, in the audiophile community. That some still just don't want to use DSP, don't want to use EQ at all. But personally, I can't really remember the last time I had the system without DSP. I couldn't.
Yeah.
It will be. I can't see the point of setting up a system and not correct for the room as much as possible.
Especially again with today, that it's not expensive. It does not cost much money. I think utilizing DSP, I don't know, 10 years ago or something, was fairly expensive. You had to have a lot of technical knowledge to do it. You obviously have it. I don't, honestly. And I'm also a little lazy, I have to admit. I mean, but I think again with I've been reading more, looking at more videos, and learning more about DSP and various software that you can use, like Dirac. I think it's probably Dirac or Dirac.
Yeah.
You have Anthem. Anthem has their system, their room correction and stuff. So you can get into it pretty easily now.
What's sort of interesting is that like the cinema home theater crowd, they've had it for 15,
forever.
20 years maybe. And
forever.
Of course, the automatic systems can be sort of hit and miss, but at least they've been aware of it way longer. So it's kind of interesting.
As far as I know, I could be wrong, but as far as I know, Anthem, they've been in the room correction for 20 years plus at least. I mean, they've been ahead of that. And as far as I know, they were the first to apply their room correction software to their 2-channel higher end product. I don't know if anybody else did it. I've never seen it. And I have an Anthem integrated amp with the Arc Genesis, and it's a game changer. I will never live without that again. I will say to anybody listening to that, once you have room correction, whether it's the easy way like I went or you do it yourself, you'll never live without it again. There's no way you would. And you don't. Not that you shouldn't have some trait, some stuff in your room to capture bass and whatever, but you reduces the amount of time that you're going to have to go think about things like bass traps and rugs over here and moving your couch around and all that. People that have wives or boyfriends or whatever that don't want rooms full of that stuff, right? The spouse approval factor. It's a game changer, right? Again, I think audiophiles some of them are still not using it, have the similar feeling that it degrades the signal. Versus, there's lossless, there's truly lossless DSP, which you have employed inside your design, obviously.
Yes. And even if you had a somewhat lossy DSP, you'd probably get better sound because it cleaned up the room.
Right.
Quite a lot. So you still need some acoustic treatments, ideally, at least in the higher frequencies. But in the low end, in the bass, it's almost impossible in a domestic environment to like fix it. But you'd have to fill your room with bass traps. It's not too viable, right? So DSP for the low end especially it's vital.
Yeah. I know some people will cut the DSP off at like 500 hertz or something like that, and only use it below that, and we'll leave the rest of it by itself or tweak it. I tend to use it full range through the Arc Genesis. I've tried their preset, and I've also gone in and played with it a little bit. I honestly like I think they do a great job, but I know that you can cut. I think most people it's around 500 hertz, but something in that, as you said, they tend to go lower.
It depends on the system as well. Some systems are sort of careful in the higher frequencies, so it works well, and some are like maybe too aggressive, so then it's better to cut off earlier. So it depends on the.
So cons of active speakers. Obviously, the obvious con that most audiophiles are going to have is they like to be able to tweak. They like to be able to change out gear.
Yeah.
And I understand that. I mean, I also, again, maybe it's an age thing, whatever. I also just find the older I get, I'm more interested in like just being able to set up my stuff clean as quickly as I can, get the audio that I want, and kind of set it and forget it. I'm not myself looking to pull amplification, preamplification in and out. But the obvious con, which I can understand if you want to play with your amplification and all that. But what else? What other cons is there to active?
Just want to comment quickly on that one as well. I agree and I understand it, but it's basically the power amplifier that's built into the speaker. You can still play around with your sources, with your preamp, so you don't lose the entire playground, but the power amp will be.
Right.
And another typical argument is that it's tend or prone to break, and then you just have to throw away the entire speaker, as opposed to if like something that your amp broke, you can replace it, right? But that's potentially harder in an active setup, depending on the service and warranty terms on the speaker.
Right.
Personally, I can't think of a lot of other disadvantages.
I can't either. I mean, obviously besides those two, the main negative that some audiophiles will hold on to is that actives cannot sound as good. They'll never sound as good. They don't sound as good.
Yeah. So if you think it's maybe the manufacturer put in a poor or cheap amp, for instance.
I mean, I can say one of the best systems I've ever heard, which has been around, is the Meridian. Meridian has been a fully active, completely integrated active system. They've been around decades, and one of the best systems I've ever heard was a Meridian system. And it's expensive. I mean, Meridian is not an inexpensive company, but I do think that a lot of audiophiles continue to cling to actives can't sound good, they don't sound good, and therefore I must have. And I think, unfortunately, that hopefully that they'll get over it, because I think it's just not true. ATC. I mean, if they sounded so bad, I mean, obviously this is a different listening environment. But if they didn't sound good, I don't think you'd have the biggest production companies, mixing companies, and that type of thing using these active speakers. Again, it is a different environment and different requirements. But clearly, if they sounded like shit, I don't think I don't think people would be using them.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point, as you had an introduction as well, that the people who actually designed the records you're listening to, they typically use Pro Studio monitors that are active.
Yeah. And ATC, I mean, that's sort of the one I'm bringing up, but there's a number of brands that are.
Yeah, in Europe, you have Newman, you have Genelec from Finland, is very well known in Europe.
Right. Yeah, Genelec. I've been wanting to hear some Genelecs for a while. They get raves from everybody that has them. I think cost-wise, and I'll throw out one more thing that it's not a negative, but I understand again how they get there. When someone looks at the cost of a good active speaker, they go, "Wow, that's a lot of money," and they're just not thinking that, in fact, it's actually less money when you factor in that amplification, connectors, a speaker wire. I mean, there's a lot of things you're saving, not just the box. There are a number of things you're saving on, and I do understand that the initial responses go, "Wow, that's a lot of money," and not to really maybe say, "Well, if I didn't have to buy amplifiers and speaker wire and so forth." I think again, it also allows the companies to save the buyer money by putting them together versus having to separate them. So I know that seems common sense, but I just find a lot of people don't think about the total cost of what they're going to put their money into.
I agree. Do you think of the speakers as the speakers, basically? So you compare the price to a passive speaker that you're thinking of buying, and then you forget that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also understand that, and I include myself in this, is that a lot of people already have invested their money in these passive systems. If I was
Yeah.
starting over from scratch, I would absolutely start with actives. Whether it's something from you or like ATC makes active version of the SCSM 40 A, which is I have the SCM 19. They've got a floor standing model, a three-way floor standing model that's all active, 3 amplifiers. That's what I would, something like that is what I would go with. But I'd have to sell everything. I'd have to start fresh. I'd have to get rid of the amplification. I would also lose the room correction, so I'd have to then add like a DSP or something in there. So I get it. I think for a lot of people who are very invested, maybe. Already.
Actually, I have a lot of discussions on that topic with customers actually, because we started out with subwoofers that are sort of music oriented. So I have a lot of discussions with called traditional audiophiles, but they have perhaps purchased subwoofers from us, and then we start discussing speakers. And I always recommend DSP as well. And when you bring DSP and active speakers into a traditional system, you actually end up changing it up quite a bit, and you probably have some gear that you're quite fond of that you may have to replace.
Yeah.
And that makes you think a bit before moving.
Yeah, and that's that's a legit concern. But there's plenty of people that are looking to invest a lot of money in these passive systems, to change out and maybe not considering going the active route, which they should. All right, so I think we covered sort of the big picture pros, cons of actives in general. Your speakers specifically, which obviously you said just won an award, the SBS1, right? So I looking at these speakers. There's a lot of additional technology that has gone in these. These aren't just sort of generic two-way active speakers. For one thing, of course, you've got this point source driver.
Yep.
Which is I'm sure there's some active speakers that use them somewhere, but not a lot. That's a pretty well. Again, they usually see like a model like Genelec uses the active. You don't see it a lot. And one of the, I know that on paper that point source driver has obvious benefits, but I know that in the past one of the biggest drawbacks was like power handling capacity.
Yep.
They could sound really good at low levels, but because you have, you only have so much room in there for the size of the magnets and all that. From the SPL rating, dynamic rating of that speaker, it sounds like you have overcome that particular problem. So how did you overcome, or how did you decide on a point source driver, and how did you overcome that limitation?
For starters, I guess we have to mention the maybe third thing as well is the fact that it's a quite small speaker and it's designed to play with a subwoofer, and it was sort of set out to prove that a small bookshelf speaker combined with a sub could sound like a big floor sounder and a big expensive floor sounder. Because we talked a bit about traditions, or a sort of myth. Another myth that we had at least here in Europe around audiophiles is that subwoofers doesn't really belong to like music system. It's something for home theater systems.
Yeah, it's
so people
another debate. Yeah, that's a very common debate.
And it's sort of related to the DSP thing as well, because they often, if they don't have DSP, you don't get even bass, right? And then I understand why you turn it off when you listen to music.
Yeah. If the subwoofer, everybody who hates subwoofers has never heard one incorporated properly.
Right.
And so understandably they hear it's muddy, it's noisy, I can understand it too. It's just they're just used to thump of home theater sound.
Yeah.
I've never heard a system ever, regardless of cost, that did not sound improved with a good subwoofer properly integrated into that subwoofer. Into that system. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so our subwoofers as well are we use really high quality drivers and everything we can to make it integrated part of any speaker system basically. But since we designed the speaker to be used with a subwoofer, suddenly we could think a bit out of the box on the drivers. So we actually looked at pro drivers, typically used in the studio or in a PA environment. So the mid bass driver in this speaker is actually a mid bass driver. It's not designed to play bass at all. It has a different suspension and is a lighter cone and is higher sensitivity, way higher sensitivity than the typical bass driver you see in a two-way speaker.
Right.
And the coaxial driver uses the cone. It's basically the same mid bass driver, but with the treble tweeter inside it, using the cone as a waveguide.
Right.
And that's also from the same pro driver kind of manufacturer. So it's designed for high SPL as well.
Right. Okay.
And since we using the coaxial driver, we actually have three drivers. It looks size wise, it looks like a two-way speaker,
Right.
but it's actually a 2.5 way or basically 3-way, and it's 3 individual amplifiers for each driver as well.
Right. So it's a coaxial drive mid tweeter driver.
Yeah.
Right.
And the mid range driver plays mid bass as well. So you basically have 2 mid bass drivers.
Right.
Both quite high sensitivity. And the tweeter is so we didn't manufacture the driver. It's a driver from, as I mentioned, a pro manufacturer. And I'm not sure how they did it, but we tested a lot of coaxial drivers, and both in quality and in SPL capacity, it's just beyond. So it's just great. It's just a great driver.
Right.
And you often see a lot of problems with the dispersion as well in the coaxial driver, but this driver is really clean.
Right. So I mean, normally in a coaxial driver, the off axis dispersion is not great, right? I mean, you have to sort of sit right in the sweet spot.
Yeah, and even though axis can be sort of wiggly sometimes. So,
right.
This is a really even driver.
So
and of course,
there's 3 separate amplifiers, right? Driving to 350 watt total output.
Yeah.
High quality.
And that's even more than it sounds, right? Because the drivers are much higher sensitivity than you typically see in a speaker like this.
Right. And those little speakers, what was the rating? The SPL rating was very high.
110 dB. So typically, a couple of speakers in a medium-sized room, you get 110 dB in the listening position, basically.
Right. Okay.
Of clean sound.
Right. So I mean, one thing you did was very smart, but also dangerous, was that you cut off the speaker at 90 decibel, right?
90 hertz.
90 hertz, right, sorry, 90 hertz.
Yeah.
So that, which is smart. So, for example, when I did a review of the SCSM, the ATC speakers, and a lot of the criticism from people was, well, they sound great, but they stop at 50 hertz or like 55 hertz, which for a speaker that large and that expensive, people say, it should do this, it should do that. And I think they had the same thought, but my point being is that, no matter what the design is, whether physics or physics, the physics are not going to change. And if you try to make a speaker that size, go below 50 hertz or whatever, you really give something up. You have to sacrifice something, right?
Yeah.
And
sacrifice
I think
a lot of
ATC might have had the same or a very similar thought in that. Yeah, so I think ATC had a similar thought that people that are going to buy a speaker like this are probably going to use a subwoofer. They should use a subwoofer, whether it's their subwoofer or not. But the mid bass of the ATC is exceptionally good, because I think they were smart enough to cut it off at 55 hertz. And so what you've done is smart, because now it's designed specifically to mate with a subwoofer to really get but people, how people are, they want everything from nothing. They want your little speakers to do 20 hertz, in a giant room.
But we sort of went all out. So again, the driver isn't designed at all to play bass, so it's, and we explicitly say you have to have a subwoofer, right? So it's not like we're hoping people will use a subwoofer. We're going out and saying you have to. So it's at least obvious.
Yeah. Like I say, I think it's a really smart idea that should obviously will pay dividends in audio quality, in clarity, dynamics,
Yeah.
SPL, because you're not trying to make it, again, pump out bass. But I think it's a certain customer that will understand what you're trying to do, and appreciate what you've tried to do there, versus trying again to make everybody happy. And it sounds like with that, well, again, with that SPL, the power, you're going to get the volume levels of a larger floor stander, and maybe in the dynamics of a floor stander with taking up less space. That's makes sense.
And the point of or the concept of a mid-range or mid-bass driver is sort of interesting as well, because you rarely see a mid-bass driver. Actually, the mid-bass drivers are from 100 to 600 hertz, and in a typical speaker you have a driver either sharing that area with the bass or with the mid-range.
Right.
So it's basically a four-way design if you count the subwoofer as well.
Yeah,
and that's it's a very important area for the drive and the rhythm and the punch in the music. It's an underrated area.
I think a lot of speaker companies, unfortunately, they know that when your average person, goes into a store to listen to speakers, the first thing that catches their ears, the highs and the lows, and the mid ranges doesn't come through. And most of the information is in the mid range. But when you go into a store and somebody cranks up some music for you, most people hear the high and the low. That's the first thing that they say, wow, that sounds great. I don't think until you have listened to a speaker with good mid-range do you know what you're missing. I think, and I've had some pretty expensive speakers that honestly I don't think the mid-range was what it could have been. I learned later with I will say ATC puts a real emphasis on mid-range, and that's what they were best known for. Their mid-range driver was what they started as, an emphasis on the mid-range. But I do think that speaker designers, but companies, like I say, they know that when you go into a store, the two things that grab people first to make decisions are the highs and the lows. And I think with a bit of time and listening to music, you start to appreciate what's in the mid-range and what you're missing.
And it's sort of often either the systems or people, like maybe if they have a subwoofer, they take the volume too high on the subwoofer to sort of get the punch that is actually in the mid bass area. So they sort of even make it worse by adding low frequency.
Right.
Well, it's actually, it's a lot of the sort of the punch people often are asking about are often in that range actually.
Yeah. I think the best way I've ever heard to explain a subwoofer is that if a subwoofer is properly set up, you only notice when it's not on. The only time you notice is when you shut it off, and then you go, wow, what happened to all my music? Where did all that full music go? But if you can hear the subwoofer, the volume is too high, or you don't have the crossover or something. But you shouldn't know it's there. You should have no idea it's there, other than it just sounds better and fuller and rounder.
Yeah, I agree. I often say you sort of turn up the gain until you could clearly hear the bass, and then turn it back again until the bass sort of falls into the mix again.
Right.
Because it's supposed to sound like one speaker, not like you have a subwoofer and a speaker.
Well, this is where again the benefits of active crossovers and DSP really come in, because you can really control. You're not just running a full range speaker and then trying to get that playing with the dial, trying to get the sub to match. You can literally cross them over at just the right point to get the most out of that speaker, whatever it may be. But I think even full range floor standers, if you don't force them to do the low end, and even if you cut them off at 80, let's say 40 hertz, 50 hertz, whatever, you've got big floor standers. if you don't make them perform those the low hertz, I think you're still going to get better sound out of adding a subwoofer.
Yeah, I agree.
So here's one question I had, which was, I noticed, so you cutting it off at 90. Now I noticed that 80 seems to actually be like the most common cutoff in home theater systems, DSP, when you're integrating subs and satellites. Why 90 versus 80?
Well, everything's a compromise, of course, but I think it's sort of a misunderstanding that a lot of people say that if it's like higher than 80, then you're guaranteed to be able to localize it if you have the sub to the side or something like that. But I think it's a THX standard, right? 80 hertz. But I think it's more like that was actually the common domain. So that was, if they put it at 80 hertz, actually no one could localize it at all.
Right.
Which means in most cases you can actually cross over quite a bit higher without being able to localize it.
Right.
So it was.
I mean, a lot of subs will play quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
Than that.
Yeah.
Seems
So
80 is the most common. Seems to me the most common place they tell you to start, at least. When you play with it in your room and that kind of thing.
So like our subs doesn't start to roll off before 250 hertz or something, so you could really cross it over high. But also we focus on music systems, and a lot of our customers actually buy dual subs and set it up like in a stereo setup. And then you can cross over as high as you like and not have a problem with localization. But we wanted to cross over as high as we could to get at as much dynamics as possible from the speaker, and while almost guaranteeing also that you couldn't localize the sound from the sub wherever you place it. So we ended up at 90 with a lot of trial and error, basically.
Right. So, but your speakers are designed to plug the sub directly into the speaker, right?
Yeah, you can do that, but you don't have to. But that's an option.
But would that be the recommended connector, or that depends on the sub, what the sub can do?
If you use our subs and you use XLR, you have dual subs, I would recommend that. But we also I will possibly not recommend doing that if you have some kind of DSP externally, which I would also recommend, because then maybe you have dedicated sub outputs from your DSP.
That's how I would set it up. Because I have DSP, room correction through the Anthem, which I can use the preamp. I can use the preamp separately, and I'll just I will run the sub out of the bass out and use my DSP and all that.
And our subs are designed for the speakers, right? So you have a preset that just set the crossover for you, but you can experiment with other crossovers if you like, basically. So you're free to set it up however and connect it however. The main benefit of connected through via the speakers is maybe less cable, basically.
Right.
So
well, if you bought your speakers and two subs, and you could plug them into those speakers and just be good you'd be all set, right? I mean, the crossover is all set up. They roll off perfectly right where they should. So for somebody that maybe doesn't want to do a lot of experimenting, it sounds like they could, plug and go just about.
Yeah, you could basically, if you want to adjust the gain on the sub to adjust for the room or for your taste, basically.
So how would you recommend people, or maybe not at all, use the equalizer with that? Would you recommend DSP and then using the equalizer, or would you just keep them flat and go through a mini DSP unit, or do it without it?
It depends on the competency of the user and customer, or what you basically would like to do. There's a 9-band manual parametric EQ that's quite advanced, built into each speaker and each sub. So you could do basically anything with that, but you would have to know what you're doing, and you would probably need to have some measurement gear so you could see what's happening in the room, right? So for the average customer, I guess it will be easier to have an external automatic DSP system.
I know some audiophiles will do it to their own personal sound. They don't care about measurements, and they'll just go in and they'll. The only time I'll do that is with inexpensive. Like I have just a little setup in my office of active speakers. There I'll do it to my sound because I don't really care. I mean, I don't care if it's flat. I don't care about it. I just want to make myself happy in my little office. But as far as
Yeah.
my home system, I wouldn't. Yeah, I'd want to measure it. But
Yeah.
I do know some audiophiles they're more subjective. They'd rather subjectively they'll run DSP and get the room flat, and they don't like it, and they'll say I didn't like it, so I went in here and I up
Yeah,
the bass gain or whatever.
that's fine. But every room is different, and if they purchase the speaker, it's their speakers, so they can do whatever,
Right.
of course.
Yeah.
And there's presets on the speaker as well. There's one like the reference setting that's how we think they should sound, and there's one that's a bit brighter, and there's also one that's a bit darker for maybe if you have a room with a lot of reflection and minimal furniture and stuff like that, so you can
So
easily
it
switch a bit.
sounds like these speakers obviously really have a lot of options. I mean, there's really a lot of options people can play with,
But
ranging
I have to
from
just,
experienced to
yeah,
not experienced.
yeah, but I have to emphasize that uh, that makes it sound a bit complicated on the speakers, right? But it's basic. It doesn't have to be. You could just set them up and play with just like with any other passive speakers, and they will sound just as good. But you have more options as well if you want.
Yeah, yeah. No, again, maybe it's age, or whatever, but I've gotten more interested again in sort of plug and play. I want to get stuff up and playing and listening to it.
Mm.
I'm not real big on tweaking things anymore. I don't play around with gear going in and out. I find trying to find it makes me happy. Which doesn't mean I'm not, every couple of years I almost start to get a urge. I need something to, new, which is why I contacted you and I wanted to hear your speakers. But I know for myself, I like components that offer a lot of flexibility, but they're easy to run. If I don't want to play with all of the possibilities, I also want to be able to plug them in and listen to music right away, and then say, okay, I want to, let me learn, let me read, let me learn, and start playing with this a little bit. So again, it does sound like a lot of options. I don't think we've even covered. When I get them and I listen to them, I'll try to cover, more of these options for people, because as you said, it can sound a little complicated. So all the things that we're discussing here, but so I'm excited about that, and I'll start as your recommendation from start without messing around, in the reference part, and run the. I'll try them with and without, just to see the difference with and without the room correction, and then take it from there. So all right, I think we covered a good general pros and cons of actives. Maybe this will convince a few people to at least give them a second look and go look at all the companies that are surprising number of companies that are starting to offer quietly. I don't know why quietly. They should be making more noise, but you'll be finding active speakers. I think they're sort of testing them on their market to see.
It's interesting because there's most of the traditional brands are starting to offer actives as well, but it's it looks a bit like their passive speakers only active. But then again, there's also a lot of quite new companies who have quite innovative speakers, quite cool active speakers that actually doing something different.
Yeah, I think newer companies like yourself, they're starting from a new perspective, or looking to, or being more innovative. As you said, I definitely noticed the more traditional companies that have been around a long time are mostly taking their traditional speaker and putting an amplifier in it. And from what I'm seeing, it's pretty much it. I'm not seeing any real innovative stuff going on.
But that could be like marketing or politics as well, because they'll be eating out of their own market, right? If they brought really good active speakers to the market. So and some of these brands are owned by larger companies who also make amplifiers, for instance. So
right, yeah, that makes that's sort of the Swatch syndrome. I don't know, Swatch, the company, Swatch, they own like almost every watch company out there, and I don't think people don't realize all of the number of watches, and a lot of the parts and are produced by different, they bought them, and so you have different companies, some very expensive watches that are the internal parts are being produced by another watch that they own, or I don't know if you saw. Swatch came out with a plastic moon watch, an Omega Speedmaster, and people said, "Oh my God, why would Omega do that? Because Swatch owns Omega too, so they don't care. To them, it doesn't matter." So yeah, I know that. I know like the Harman Group. There's a number of big companies that own a whole bunch of smaller audio. As you said, if you produce a really fantastic active speaker, you could be eating into your own, certainly your own, and I'm sure there's good profit in amplification. And again, it's business. You want people to be excited about new products, so you come up with an amplifier, and then you come up with a new amplifier, and it makes sense.
Yeah, and I just a speculation, of course, but the traditional companies, it's probably not because they can't do it. I think they can if they want to. It's more of a and the market is still slower in the active speaker segment as well, I think so.
Yeah. Well, I think active speakers, again, with as we're talking about high quality Class D amps and a DSP. I mean, what's interesting. There are a lot of audiophiles that are actually very positive, very open to active crossovers, and yet they don't like. They'll be open to an active crossover into a more traditional speaker, and yet they don't like things that we were talking. Some of the other things we've been talking about, which there are some companies that will make, like Bryston makes a passive and an active version of the same. It's not an active crossover. It's not an active speaker, but it's an active crossover. So you're still running it on a standard amplifier, but it's going through an active crossover. And they're very open to that. I mean, and sometimes what I know that they do is they will take a traditional speaker and remove the crossover, the passive crossover, and make it an active crossover speaker. And for whatever reason, they're very open to that, but don't seem to, so there's a little bit of disconnect, in what they'll, because everybody I know who has had use active crossovers says, again, it's you'll never go back, once you're using an active crossover. That I've heard that from pretty much everybody, and it's a little bit of a niche, but yeah, I do think active speakers are going to be more accepted. I think there's just more younger people getting into audio that are just more used to, again, one in a box, or just one option for music. They're okay with that. I think that there's people that are also getting older that want really top quality sound, and they just don't want. They're just getting tired of tweaking and having a lot of wires and all that. So I think I think that the time is right. The combination, I guess the culture and the technology is now meeting finally. I think where there's you can meet like this, and then they're going to grow together. I think that's where we're at, and you're in a good location, I think, for that.
Yeah, let's hope
so. All right, well, excellent.
Certainly look forward to hearing what you think of the speakers.
Yes, so I'm going to we'll finish this, and when I get them, I'll obviously set them up and listen and have a good time, and then you'll have another reviewer, Jay, who's a popular kid, and again, I think he's the perfect option for these speakers, again, because he's a younger guy. I think he's probably just more open to new technologies and not being too stuck in his old audiophile, records and tubes and horn speakers, and that's it, So yeah, all right. So good to talk to you. Thanks for being on, and I'm sure it's late in Norway.
Yeah, 11 p.m.
Okay, 11 p.m. All right. So have a good one, and we'll converse offline, and we'll move forward with the speakers when I get them.
Great. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye bye.